I think this is an important time to pay attention to the potential use, the dangers of the potential use of nuclear weapons. My next guest is an expert on the interplay of politics and science, and most notably, the history of nuclear weaponry and nuclear power. Bill Lanouette was a senior analyst at the Government Accounting Office, the investigative arm of Congress. And before serving in this post, he was a journalist for 3 decades, writing for Newsweek, The Observer, being Washington correspondent for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He's published in The Atlantic, The Economist, The Scientific American, and the Smithsonian, just to name a few. Welcome, Bill Lanouette. Why did you personally take up the interest in the decision making and planning around the atomic bomb?
I think as a journalist with a background in politics, I was interested in the intersection of science and politics. And there's nothing like atomic energy to combine the two, both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And I think the science of nuclear weapons, which began in 1939, 40, 41, with an arms race against Germany, have continued to dominate the whole political and social and historical situation. And to see how science and politics interact, how they affect one another, is something that's fascinated me my whole career.
I'm interested in talking with you now because of your work in writing about the conversations that happen among scientists, including Leo Szilard, and you've written a play with a colleague, Peter Cook, called Uranium and Peaches. And I'm talking to you because many people are expressing concern about our nuclear weapons situation right now. So do you have any concerns right now? And does your play go into anything that would give us insight?
I think the situation with nuclear weapons has probably never been worse. I mean, we came close to using nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think the situation now is quite different from what happened during and after World War II. I think we had a race with Germany in the early 1940s, although ironically, the same month that Germany quit the arms race, we scaled up and handed it over to the Army. That was June of 1942. But we were afraid that the Germans had the bomb until probably late 1944, when we discovered that they, in fact, did not even advance to having a nuclear chain reaction. After the war, it was Szilard's fear and that of other scientists that we should try to have international control of nuclear weapons because of a fear of an arms race with Russia. Well, of course, that's just what happened. And then the number of warheads and the power of warheads just escalated through the 1940s and 50s and 60s, until at one point we had something like 60,000 nuclear warheads between us and the Soviet Union. We're now down to about 4,000 each, which may sound reassuring, but even using half of those could destroy life on this planet. So we're not out of the shadow of nuclear weapons yet by any case. I think the play Uranium Plus Peaches shows the first time that scientists tried to control the weapon that they had created. Understandably, a lot of the scientists were refugees from Hitler's Germany, and they feared that Hitler would use these weapons if he had them. In 1939, January, it was announced that uranium would split or fission, and this gave the scientists assurance that the element that might actually make nuclear weapons was indeed identified. This scared people like Leo Szilard to the point where he went to his friend Albert Einstein and warned him about nuclear chain reactions and nuclear weapons, and drafted a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, which led to the Manhattan Project, which allowed us over the course of the war to build and use two bombs on Japan. But the scientists were more concerned, I think, about what would happen after the war if we used this against Japan, which did not have nuclear weapons. We were really trying to build a deterrent weapon against the Germans. And I think the arms race after the war was also one of deterrence. They called it mutual assured destruction, or MAD, which meant that no side would dare use these weapons because they knew that the retaliation would be complete. So nuclear weapons in that sense, for several decades, were actually a deterrent, and they gave us some sense of stability. Well, the reason I'm especially concerned now is that there's no symmetrical deterrence that we can really count on. A country like North Korea, or a country like Pakistan, or a country like Israel might use their nuclear weapons at some point that is totally unpredictable and asymmetrical. Another fear, of course, is that terrorists get a hold of a nuclear bomb, and that they deliver it to the US, not necessarily with a missile or even an airplane, or perhaps even in the hold of a cargo ship. Now, Robert Oppenheimer, who was the scientist who directed the Los Alamos laboratory where they designed and made the first bombs, was asked after the war, well, what's the most effective weapon for controlling nuclear weapons? And he said, all you need is a screwdriver. By that he meant that any hold of any ship with wooden packing crates could contain an explosible nuclear weapon. And you'd have to open every case in order to find out whether or not there was in fact a bomb on the ship. I think today we still have the threat of someone sneaking a weapon in by ship to one of our harbors. And we do have detectors for some radioactive materials, but not all ships are scanned, and not all detectors work all the time. So we're still living, I think, now in a very unpredictable way with nuclear weapons, whereas the Cold War, for all its terror, was at least predictable and you might even say rational.
I think it's important to have this discussion because I think that there was much in the 60s, there was much conversation about the danger. Most people who grew up in that time had a sense of how horrible this could be. But the current generation hasn't really been exposed to the dangers. They may have an abstract understanding, but I think it's important when we hear political figures now threatening to use them, that we understand how truly dangerous this is.
I think the nuclear weapons are terrible for two reasons. One is that they're so destructive that the weapons now in the hands of the Soviets and the the Russians and the Americans are hundreds of times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. It's almost unimaginable. And since nuclear weapons have not been tested since the 1960s above ground, people haven't even seen nuclear explosions to see what the effects are. I think you're absolutely right that a lot of people think they're like other weapons or rockets or something, and they have no conception of just what the destruction would be from even a single nuclear weapon. In the 1950s, we had duck and cover. We had the notion that we could be attacked by the Soviet Union. And people, I think, were much more fearful of nuclear annihilation. I think that the concept or the idea that terrorists would get hold of a nuclear weapon hasn't really registered with a lot of people, because they have never seen the effect of except photos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have never seen the effect of a nuclear weapon on a city. And to that extent, I think if people are now talking in this government about tactical nuclear weapons as if they're just things that you lob around the battlefield, why the whole terror of nuclear weapons is diminished. So I think we are facing a real challenge of educating the public to just how destructive one or two of these things could be.
It's a strange situation where we sort of believe that science will always have a solution to whatever problem there is. And yet we also have people who just are sort of anti-science at the same time. But is there any hope for a scientific resolution of this problem?
I don't think so. There's maybe, I think you might be mixing science with technology. In the sense that scientists using scientific principles designed these things, but it was engineers who actually built them. The idea of deterrence seems to have worked in the sense that it scared both sides into the notion of never using these things for fear of automatic retaliation. There's some hope in the technology of anti-missile defense, but this has been proven to be really illusory. The US has had an national anti-missile defense program for decades now, and they've tested a number of these things as if you're going to shoot down one missile with another, and most of the tests have been serious failures. It's not an easy thing to hit one missile against another, especially if the warheads include decoys. So you might be hitting a decoy and not the incoming missile. Technology is frankly not ready to assure that an incoming missile to the United States would be hit with an outgoing missile that would take it down. I think the only hope here is that they have what they called a boost phase attack, where you have missiles, say you're afraid of North Korea launching a missile against the United States. All around North Korea, you have ships and submarines that have missiles that could hit any launch as soon as it starts to rise and before it gets into the trajectory where it's falling back to Earth. This seems to be the most reliable way that you might stop a missile attack. And but there's no assurance that technology would come up with a reliable anti-missile system. Again, it isn't just missiles that we should worry about, but perhaps bombers and perhaps even cargo ships if it comes to a country trying to blow up one of our cities.
Well, let's go back a bit into where you've spent a number of years with your play going around the country. What is the nature of the conversation in the play?
Well, this is a play that it's a one-act play, takes place May 28th, 1945. And I'll back up a bit by mentioning Leo Szilard again, since he's one of the three characters. Szilard relied on Einstein to, as Einstein said, be his mailbox. And Einstein sent many letters in Szilard's behalf to President Franklin Roosevelt. In March of 1945, Szilard was convinced that Germany did not have the bomb and that if we tried to use it, it would only set off an arms race with then our ally, the Soviet Union. So he got another letter from Einstein to Franklin Roosevelt, saying you should talk to Dr. Szilard about post-war control of their work. Well, FDR died before the letter arrived. So when Szilard took that letter to the Truman White House, he was sent to Spartanburg, South Carolina. May 28th, 1945, took an overnight train from Washington. Along with him was the Nobel laureate in chemistry, Harold Urey, who had figured out how to separate uranium, which we used successfully in the Hiroshima bomb. And so here are two scientists who made the bomb and want to stop it, meeting the politician who can't wait to use it. Mm-hmm. That politician is James F. Burns. He was a congressman from South Carolina, a senator from South Carolina. Then Franklin Roosevelt put him on the Supreme Court, and then he took him off the Supreme Court to make him assistant president, working in the White House to run war mobilization. There's a cover story in 1942 on Life magazine showing Burns as the assistant president. It was assumed that Burns would become the nominee for vice president after President Roosevelt was dissatisfied with Henry Wallace. But what happened in 1944 was that the anti-labor and segregationist attitudes of Burns, the Southern Democrat, turned off a lot of the people at the convention, and Harry Truman became the compromise candidate for vice president. So when President Roosevelt died in April 1945, it was Harry Truman who became president. Now, Jimmy Burns had been his mentor in the Senate. Jimmy Burns had been the first person to tell him about nuclear weapons when he was, after Truman was sworn in. And Burns was Truman's handpicked man on the committee, the interim committee, deciding whether and how to use the atomic bomb. So the scientists have really met somebody who is probably personified as the person deciding on atomic policy towards the end of World War II. Now, this is a confrontation between the scientists and Burns, and Burns ridicules them as being naive. Burns complains about spending $2 billion and not telling Congress, so he's very political. He also knows that he's about to become Secretary of State, and he's afraid that the Russians need to be made more manageable because of their aggression in Eastern Europe. So we have here political and diplomatic reasons for and against using the bomb. I think that this is the first of many examples where the scientists tried to take back what they had created, but with very little success in the end.
Was there horror about Nagasaki and Hiroshima right after the bomb was dropped, or the bombs were dropped?
Oh, it was assumed that this was a new form of warfare, and conservatives and liberals and people almost universally condemned the possibility of destroying cities with this power. On the other hand, the bomb became the winning weapon because coincidentally it happened to be used at the end of the war. But a lot of people believe we won the war because of the bomb. I don't happen to agree with that position, and I think that it was more coincidental that the bomb was used at the same time. The big justification, and it comes out in the play, for using the bomb is to prevent a loss of life from a necessary invasion of Japan. But the first invasion of the South Island wasn't planned until November of 1945, and the invasion of the main island was going to be in March of 1946. So why did we use the only two bombs we had in August? Well, it seems to me, and a lot of scholars, that the Soviet Union comes into this equation. The Soviet Union was our ally in Europe fighting Nazi Germany. But to avoid a two-front war, Stalin had a non-aggression pact with Japan. So we were fighting Japan, and the British allies were fighting Japan, but Russia was not fighting Japan. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, Stalin told Franklin Roosevelt that he would join the war against Japan 3 months after Germany surrendered. Well, that was August 8th. 3 months after Germany surrendered, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan.
Let's take that sentence again. 3 months after.
3 months after Germany surrendered, Stalin declared war on Japan. Now, Burns was afraid that Stalin would get in on the kill and divide up the spoils, that there would be a North and South Japan, just as there was a North and South Korea. And he wanted to use the bomb before August 8th, meaning before the Soviet Union became our ally against Japan. So there's that tension, diplomatic tension, behind when and how quickly we used the bomb. It's interesting to me that I think Truman was swept up in the whole decision. He deferred to, I can't shut that off. I'm going to have to let it.
Let's just let it ring.
Let it ring.
You can answer it even, and we can pause for a minute.
No, I put the phone in the other room. It's just ringing here for some reason. Okay. Anyway, let's start again. Okay, ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Truman was caught up in this.
Stalin had promised that he would declare war on Japan on August 8th, or 3 months after Germany surrendered, which turned out to be August 8th. Everybody remembers a couple of dates, but not all the dates. They remember August 6th, when we bombed Hiroshima. They remember August 9th, when we bombed Nagasaki, and they remember August 15th, when Japan surrendered. But they forget two other dates. One is August 8th, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And the other is August 10th, when President Truman saw the first reports about Hiroshima and decided and ordered that we should not ship the third bomb to the Pacific without his specific orders. And this, to me, was the first time Truman really got a chance to decide about the bomb. And he said he didn't like the idea of killing all those kids. So he had seen how destructive the bomb was, and he didn't want to use it again without his specific authorization. This is an interesting point because I think that we have always assumed that the president has absolute power over how these weapons are used. And in the case of Truman, it seemed to me that he was somebody who was almost blindsided by the fact that this bomb would destroy a city as opposed to a military target.
But Hiroshima is the first bomb, and then Nagasaki is the second.
The second and the last.
So how did Nagasaki come about then, if Truman had this horror?
Well, he didn't get the briefing till the 10th of August. We dropped the bomb on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. But the delay of the information coming to the White House showed him the destruction of Hiroshima on the 10th of August. The orders were also written to be used as ready, and Truman assumed that these were going to be military targets. But when he discovered that they were cities like any other, he was horrified and ordered that no third bomb would be shipped. At that point, we would have a bomb ready about every 10 days.
You know, we're going to have longer conversations because this has opened up a whole bunch of questions, but I think we have to get to the core of you right now.
Okay.
That is your commitment to peace. You were very involved in an organization called the Phonetic Society,
right,
which is where I got to meet you and hear you.
Sure.
So your writing, your motivation for continuing the play, can you tell me what drives you to make sure this play is seen?
I think the notion that science and politics are interdependent and that individual scientists and individual politicians can sway human events. And that although Harold Urey and Leo Szilard couldn't dissuade James F. Burns from pushing to use this weapon as soon as we could, they could later write a petition to the Secretary of War urging a demonstration, and they failed there, but they kept trying. Szilard then had a petition to the president to consider the moral implications of using a bomb. 155 Manhattan Project scientists signed that. And after the war, even though they didn't stop the bombing of the Japanese cities at the time, they then lobbied successfully to take the bomb out of the hands of the Army and put it in a civilian atomic energy commission. So they did have limited success. They had limited success talking to scientists from different countries and working out arms control agreements and working out test bans and other things. So while the scientists had effectively lost control of this weapon, they were able to, I think, moderate its effects. So I think the idea that one or two individuals can sit down with one or two other powerful people and have some effect is what gives us, we hope, some assurance that these weapons will never be used again.
Is there anything you'd like to add that I've not asked you about?
I think the fear that we have of nuclear weapons is real. I hope we never have to see another city destroyed by nuclear weapons. And I think that the sooner we recognize them for the terrible things they are, as opposed to being bargaining chips or threats or tactical weapons, I think the sooner we'll continue to cut the number of warheads that are available. But there are already thousands more than we need. And there doesn't seem in this administration to be much interest in reducing them.